we celebrate and commemorate over 20,000 women who marched to the Union buildings on the 9th of August in 1956 in protest against the extension of apartheid passed laws to women. 65 years later, we reflect and ask the question, how far are we as a country in realizing women's rights? To talk to me about this, I'm joined by the former South African Local Government Association CEO, Dr. Makhosi Khoza, gender activist and researcher at the University of Johannesburg, Lisa Vetten, and founder of the South African Women Fight Back, Bronwyn Litkie. And to be a part of this conversation tonight, you can WhatsApp your questions and your comments to 072 110 5584. Otherwise, you can tweet us tonight at Newzroom 405. Good evening, ladies, and thank you very much for your time and joining us today here on In Focus.
Hi, Taba. Thanks very much.
Hi, Jolie.
Bronwyn, let's start with you tonight. Have we gone far enough to ensure fuller equality in South African life when we're talking equal rights and opportunity for all women and young girls?
Look, I think, my background definitely focuses more on gender-based violence when it comes to my knowledge. We have definitely taken the right steps in the right direction, but there's a lot to be broken down still. There's a lot of patriarchal walls. There's a lot more that we could be doing for women, I think, especially when it comes to the field that I work in within gender-based violence. It's one thing to be eradicating gender-based violence, but a lot of things that we deal with are, after it's happened. And a lot of women in domestic violence don't have roots out because they don't have means of jobs or education. So we, personally, I think we do need to do a lot more in the GBV sector with creating opportunity for victims that have had these crimes happen to them and helping to kind of lead them in a direction where they can heal properly and find employment. With domestic violence, most women will go back 8 to 9 times before they actually leave because of lack of employment or sufficient help.
Yeah, certainly, and we are going to tackle some of the local issues that are still pressing today and examine that particular impact on women. But broadly speaking, tonight, Lisa, let's talk about how we have been managing the situation of gender equality up until this point. Would you say we have seen a marked change in attitudes, in our understanding of women's rights in the country?
I think it's useful to think about this in stages. Prior to 1994, there wasn't any such thing as a protection order. You basically had to wait until your husband or your boyfriend beat you black and blue before you could do anything about it. And that kind of reflects the attitude. Adrian Flock, who was the Minister of Police at that time, said the police don't get involved in domestic violence out of humanitarian reasons. They don't think it's right to get involved in family matters. So the fact that now there are duties and obligations on them to do so does suggest we've made some headway. But I think our biggest breakthrough probably happened around about the time of the transition to democracy in the early 90s, when it was a lot easier to write laws that were in accordance with the Constitution. I think the real challenges started from the 2000s onwards, once we had to translate that vision into a day-to-day reality. I think there were challenges because very often I think what we aspire to doesn't always match our reality. But I think the last 10 years under state capture and the way it has substantially eroded the state's institutions, the way it has robbed the fiscus and taken money away from projects that would have made a difference to women, the fact that it's put into positions people who don't really care about much except their own self-interest. One of the consequences of that is I think you can actually see a rollback in some of the gains that were achieved in the first 10 to 15 years of democratization.
Let's talk about the 10 to 15 years. Are we paying attention, for example, to the gender perspective in every policy and program, right? Do we take a gender lens in public policy? Let's start there.
Well, maybe let me come in there, Julie. I agree with Lisa, with both Lisa and Browning. We've made some gains, very remarkable gains in South Africa. However, we have undone almost all of them. And the reason why I am saying so, in 1994, we had a woman called the Prex Governor in Parliament. And this woman was a champion of a gender-based budget. And everything at that stage, we were looking at it we were always taking into account the gender issues whenever we are discussing on issues of service delivery, of policy matters, and so forth. However, today we can see that we have retrogressed a lot. It's actually even scary. I think there are parallels here. When a society becomes inherently corrupt, it actually undermines all the gains that women have made, because they become embroiled in that. Even women who are political leaders, who are in parliament, somehow they shelve the gender issue and they focus on party issues. Yeah. Because it's all about patronage. It's all about protecting the system of patronage. It's no longer about, advancing the agenda that, takes society forward. Yeah. So I would say to you, we have really betrayed what women like Lillian Ngoyi were envisaging in the New South Africa, Ruth First, Fatima Mie, and women like that. And all these women that I'm mentioning are women that were part of the 1956 march. And they were coming from all the racial groups, cultural groups, religious groups, whatever. And I think we've done a disservice to that. Right. And I think it's about time as women, we start checking in and look back and say, what have we done to the baton that we were given by these women who sacrificed their lives so we may enjoy equal rights like every other South African? Right.
Appreciate that contribution. And Lisa, one of the things, or one of the tools that came into our lexicon and into our conversation was something called gender mainstreaming. Talk to me about how significant that tool was, particularly in adopting and promoting gender equality. What is it actually, and did we use it effectively?
No, we haven't used it effectively. So I think just to explain very briefly what gender mainstreaming should entail, the theory of it, is that essentially what you're supposed to do is, instead of treating women as a separate little ghetto and a separate little special interest grouping, what one should do is look at all of life and understand the different ways in which it is gendered. For example, transport. Do women and men access transport in the same way? Are their transport needs the same? I'm using a very basic example. And when one does that kind of analysis, you're then supposed to look at, well, how are we thinking and what sort of assumptions are we making that perhaps don't take gender adequately into account? And I think a very obvious example now, if we take the lockdown, is every time you close the schools, the impact is almost invariably much greater on women. The impact on their work, the impact on the amount of childcare they do is almost disproportionately greater on them than it will be on men. We have seen some men step up, but I think if you look at the data, it's still predominantly women who are taking the bulk of childcare. Yeah. So there's no real realization of the impact specifically on women every time that gets introduced in terms of the lockdown. Yeah. So gender mainstreaming would try and look at that and would think, how do we mitigate and try to ensure that the impact is not disproportionate and that it's also not disadvantageous on either women and sometimes men. Yeah. And you're supposed to then look at policy and take that into account. I would say we haven't done a very good job of that. What we've done is we've confused gender mainstreaming with ideas of gender representativity. So we spend much more time counting how many women are in what positions, which in many ways I think can end up benefiting elite women, rather than thinking about what is the impact of our day-to-day decisions and how do we ensure that we make decisions that are not disadvantageous, that don't disproportionately impact on women. And when we think about women, how do we also remember that no woman is ever just a woman? She also belongs to, women belong to many other groups at the same time. They may have disabilities, they may be experiencing racial disadvantage, as many black women still do in South Africa. They may have disabilities. How do we ensure that we also recognize that women are multidimensional and that we take all those different aspects of the experience into account to ensure that we have a rich idea of equality, not something very thin that benefits a few and leaves out many others. Yeah.
Bronwyn, let's take that practical lived experience in gender mainstreaming. For example, when we look at relief offered during COVID-19 to gender-based violence victims and the infrastructure that was made available, did that take into consideration the lived experience of women in how, for example, they were allowed to report, the directives that were issued, and how police would have responded, and what the expectations were during the time of COVID for victims of gender-based violence?
I can tell you straight up, there was no protocol taken. Everything was dealt with as if it was a usual situation. You know, us as MPOs, we struggle. We struggle a lot, and last year was shocking for us. We had, you know, we've got limited resources. We run SA Women Fight Back. We're completely volunteer work. And I mean, our inboxes, our numbers were going crazy every day. There's only so much that we can do. And when there's a lack of safe houses and there's a lack of resources, and, you know, some safe houses that were out like, you know, not in your mainstream cities in Cape Town, they weren't even getting food parcels, you know. So when you have domestic violence going, the numbers shooting through the roof like it did, you need to have things in place where these women can go and get help. But if your safe houses are full, where do they go, you know? So there definitely is a lack of resources when it comes to GBV and how we can actually assist these women properly. Yeah.
We continue in a moment with our panel tonight in conversation on Women's Month, as we kick off Women's Month, on some of the issues that are still pressing in a contemporary South Africa that still needs to be tackled. When we come back, Dr. Makhosi, Khoza, I want you to weigh in on the education aspect of things and the type of education. What is the type of education that is being given, but also access to education, gender parity in educational enrollment. And we'll take joined tonight by former South African Local Government Association CEO, Dr. Makhosi Khoza, gender activist and researcher at the University of Johannesburg, Lisa Vetten, and founder of South African Women Fight Back, Bronwyn Litkie. And you're a part of the conversation tonight on WhatsApp on 072-110-5584. We'll get to those messages in a moment. Of course, today we're interrogating what we have achieved so far in as far as advancing the cause and the campaign of gender equality. Dr. Makhosi Khoza, I know you're passionate about education. It's one area that you passionately talk about. But let's talk then about the type of education that we are giving to young women and girls, right? We speak of a gap, for example, when we talk the STEM field, science, maths, technology, in as far as there's a more number of men in that field than there are women currently. What are we getting wrong? What is the type of education that is being given to girls, but also the measure of ensuring that girls actually do get to school, rather?
Thank you very much, Thabo. You know, one of the key, the fundamental things that we need to confront in South Africa is that we had Bantu education, which was not only racist, but it was also sexist. And nothing at all has been done in transforming the system of education in South Africa. We don't have quality education in South Africa. The education that we have, it does not favor women to a very large extent. And there have been numerous studies that show, you know, the parallels between education and advancement of women in society, women's rights in society. For example, if women are not educated, they are most likely going to be reduced into children-making factory. I'm sorry to say it that bluntly, but when women are educated, they have a lot more control over their bodies. They can decide how many children they want to have. They always factor in a lot of other, you know, factors into the equation of whether we are advancing or not. And the other thing that I find extremely disturbing in South Africa is that despite the fact that we have the Libombo bone, which is the most advanced mathematical artifact in the world, and this mathematical artifact, and all mathematicians agree, the authors of that mathematical artifacts were women. Yet, we don't study about that in schools. Again, even if you talk about, you know, the movie Hidden Figures, the women, the black African women, Afro-American women that were behind Apollo landing on the moon. And we don't have that in South Africa. We have a lot of role models around the world of women that have made absolutely outstanding things in history, and we have not yet revised that. Furthermore, if you are going to insist that children at school must study in English and not introduce maybe a system of bilingualism, in other words, you elevate the 9 Black African languages as tools of prestige and prosperity, and you also ensure that even textbooks are written in both the English language as an international language and the language of one of the other 10 languages, including Afrikaans, so that textbooks are bilingual. We are not going to win our war against a lot of social ills in society, and we are not going to encourage women to participate in STEM. And I am saying this because I'm extremely passionate about using Black African languages to demystify mathematics, because in Black African languages, you find the concepts of sets because their nouns are arranged into clusters or class sets. So I am saying there is so much wealth that we have in Black African languages, but for whatever reason, the Department of Basic Education is not necessarily concerned about bridging that gap. They are happy with entrapping our young children, in particular, in the social grant and child support grant. And to be honest with you, child support grant, yes, it's good. But on the other hand, we also need to look at the detriments or the disadvantages of having a child support grant without having a good education system, an empowering education system that teaches a child to think than to just remember. Right. Because that's the kind of education system that we have in South Africa. And that is detrimental to the girl child in particular, because they are actually, if you look at those that are dropping off at universities, those few that actually succeed to get to the university, it's mostly girls.
Right.
And that's very sad.
And Lisa, that's a very important thing, that even though there are marked improvements as far as level of education in women, there are still major disparities between men and women on employment. We speak of balanced paid work, and something that is yet not realized. So what is it? I mean, even though there are improved levels of education, that does not translate into, I suppose, reduced segregation in the workplace?
Well, there are a couple of things. I mean, too often, and I think if you look at our policy has made exactly the same mistake. It said equal pay for equal work, and it's assumed that men and women are doing the same work, and the reason why there are pay disparities is because employers are simply paying women less. That is a big mistake, and it fundamentally misunderstands what the problem is. Our economy is structured in gendered ways. What that means is that men and women don't do the same work. So it's very hard to pay women the same because you don't have a male comparator doing the same work. So you find the great bulk of women are concentrated in what we call caring professions. The third biggest employer of women is domestic work, for example. Men don't do domestic work. That's women's work. So you can't find a comparator where you can say equal work for equal pay. Nursing, teaching, the social services, all the work that Bronwyn was talking about, that's predominantly performed by women, and it's undervalued. We think it should be done on a voluntary basis, for instance. We think it can be done on the basis of subsidies, which is what Department of Social Development pays. It doesn't pay in full for the kind of social services work that predominantly women do. And you can find that if you look at the NGO sector, which is predominantly doing social services, 70% of it is women. So all of our worst paid and lowest paid work and professions in South Africa are predominantly feminized. They are occupied predominantly by women. So we have to increase the status of that work. But our economy has unfortunately been built on low pay, on paying women less. It's also been built on the idea that women don't actually really need their jobs because they're going to be staying at home looking after children. And so it doesn't take into account the fact that many women perform a double shift. they have their job,
yeah.
and then they go home and look after children.
Yeah.
So one of the reasons why they also earn less than men is because men don't have the same kinds of responsibilities for looking after children. They can then spend more hours at work and therefore earn more. Plus, they don't take time off work in order to look after children. So, all of that becomes compounding, and it increases women's disadvantage. They don't advance as rapidly as men, and therefore they don't earn the same as men, and therefore you have this gender pay gap. So you need to do much more than simply give a policy that says equal pay for equal work being performed by men and women in the same job. You have to understand the very different kinds of work that women do and take into account their caring responsibilities as well.
Yeah. Bronwyn, let's talk about that as well. During a time of the pandemic, last year in particular, a lot was said about this question that Lisa is raising of domestic responsibility. Did we have a shift in a mindset? Did we see a new mindset when it comes to that? Because, a lot of us were working from home, but as Lisa was saying, women were still expected to continue with the domestic responsibilities while holding a Zoom meeting at the same time.
I think the problem is women that are often stuck in domestic violent relationships, it's usually quite textbook. They are with a narcissist. Narcissistic behavior is usually 90% of domestic violence cases. And when you are with a narcissist, they have a very set way of doing things and a very set way in which a woman is seen. A woman must work if she can. If not, she must be at home taking care of the kids. I don't think what happened last year shifted anything at all, to be honest. I think it actually made things worse because the abuse was at home all the time now. So where the man used to go to work and then come home, and it used to just happen in the evenings, and obviously things with like poverty increasing, job loss. I think everybody went through a hard time last year, but in abusive relationships it escalated quite badly.
Yeah. And as far as the justice and accountability is concerned, are we comprehensively addressing violence against women as far as, for example, including a prevention strategy, which is one of the big issues, right? Because once the abuse has happened is after the fact, but are we doing enough to address the prevention strategy, things that would prevent it from actually happening?
So this goes back to what Doctor was saying, education. We can't be on the same systems that we were, and it goes the same with law. We're abiding by laws that were written a very, very long time ago, and we live in a very different world now. We find a lot of the time that the abuser actually gets more rights in the law than what the victim does. Sadly, there needs to be massive shifts in our court system and how we handle GBV cases. Because at the moment, a rape case is taking longer than 2 years to finalize. And, the victim is having to go back to court time and time and time again and see her abuser. That we find almost 50% of abuse cases will drop the cases because it is actually just too traumatic to keep having to do this. So like our education system, there has to be massive shifts in things where, a woman victim is treated with respect, and there is a complete shift in how we deal with things. But currently we're just trying to do the same thing over and over, and if nothing changes, nothing changes. There's a lot that we have to kind of relook in our country to make things better.
Lisa, I don't know how many times you and I have had this particular conversation around the cases that just take so long. Are we advancing the agenda of ending gender-based violence at all? I mean, are we making any headway?
Yes, and this is where it's useful to, I think, take the historical long view. Is if we look at, let's take the last 30 years of what's happened in South Africa. If you look at the statistics, then it's very clear that the high point of violence against women was in the 1990s. If we look at our figures for women's murders by their intimate male partners, they've halved. If we look between 1999 to 2009, they halved. We saw a similar drop in rape. And one of the reasons, of course, is that South Africa was going through an enormous amount of conflict during the 80s and then into the early 90s. So we saw a spillover of that. So the conflict reduced, which helped reduce some of the violence. And we also saw the introduction, I think, of the Constitution, some important new law. And so I think we may have seen some generational shifts which have contributed to those decreases. That's if we take the long view. However, I think if you're somebody who's in an abusive relationship today, it's no consolation to you to know that 25 years ago it was worse than it is now, because that really doesn't help you. So I think we've got to try and understand why it is that at some point we were making headway and we stopped making headway. Because if I go back to murder, so murder we've halved, but in 2012 things shifted in South Africa. And it's most pronounced in relation to men. Murder has gone up every single year since 2012, whereas for women it's kind of up, it's increased, decreased, increased, decreased. So it's telling us that there was a period, a very recent period in South Africa's history where we were changing things. Things were different, but things have shifted. And so as I said, we spoke in the beginning about some of the political and other changes that have happened. The questions we have to ask is, what difference did they have? To what extent has the lack of funding that's been left perhaps taken money away from training for the police? To what extent has the kind of corruption that's gone on in the police and the weakening of the NPA also had an effect on rape cases and domestic violence cases? So I think we've got to look at what's happened recently to aggravate and worsen the problem, in addition to the problem that I think has always been there. And I think to also get away from this idea, and we've just done it again now, is to assume that law will solve everything. So we have 3 new bills waiting in the National Assembly. I think parts of them will make an important difference. But some of them, frankly, they're repeating what we've already done, and it hasn't had a lot of effect. The problem is not in the law, it's in the way it gets implemented. And I mean, to go back to what I was saying about the police, we can see over the last 5-6 years in particular how discipline in the police has practically evaporated. That's really concerning, because the Domestic Violence Act is a big chunk that deals with misconduct and action that's supposed to be taken against police officers who fail to adhere to the Domestic Violence Act. Right. If we can see such a massive fall-off in that, then quite clearly the law is a waste of, the law is not even worth the paper it's written on.
Yeah. We'll continue in a moment, Dr. Makhosi, because I know you want to weigh in because of your own personal experience as well. And our conversation continues. Dr. Makhosi, Khoza, Lisa, Vetten, and Bronwyn Litkie with us tonight. Let's get your views as well on 072-110-5584. We are now tackling, of course, the prevailing issue in South Africa, another pandemic, one would want to say, of gender-based violence. Before the break, some of the issues being raised, particularly around law enforcement and discipline within the police service. Dr. Makhosi, because at some point you also were looking for police protection when you were suffering a level of intimidation in the country. Did you get any justice?
I never got any justice. In fact, it became more of a risk to even have police around me, because most women that I know who have had police guarding them, unfortunately, they are no longer with us. And in KZN, in the province where I come from particularly, it actually, political killings compromise our democracy. Women do not stand as what candidates, as a good example. And I can tell you about Umlazi. In Umlazi, in the past few years, we've had over 20 political killings, and most of those women, most of those councillors that were killed are women. And most of the women, if you tell them that you need to occupy these spaces of influence, they are terrified, and I don't blame them, because even my own children were saying, Mom, can't you just bow down and stop politicking and just focus on bringing us up and doing whatever. And I think it's something that we need to seriously focus on in South Africa, because it undermines our democracy.
There's a lot of money we're spending on our court systems, ensuring that there are more courts for gender-based violence, safe houses and so forth and so forth. Is that worthwhile investment? Is that good investment? Is that the type of blueprint we should follow if we want to see success in this particular field? Anyone can take it. Dr. Khoza, you can come in, and maybe Lisa, you can weigh in as well, and Bronwyn.
I'm going to go back to what I was saying earlier on. Education, education, education is going to be absolutely critical. Education is fundamental in addressing the gender-based violence and in addressing a lot of gender-related issues in our society. And that is because when you go to a classroom, it's not about a boy or a girl. It's about students. It's about learners. And the sooner we do that, the better.
But Dr. Khoza, one would say you will meet that at an educational institution. sexual harassment is in the workplace. You'll get the education, you'll be employed.
Yes,
when you get, you will
yes.
still meet it there with all the education that you have.
You are absolutely right. You are absolutely right. I'm saying to you, if we wanted to deal with these issues, you know, we needed to take a short-term, long-term view. The short-term, obviously, we need shelters. We do need all the other things that we have. We have very few of them. By the way, in most townships, there are no shelters for abused women. And you find that they are far away from where the people are. So even the shelters are still kind of arguably an elitist kind of thing. It's a privilege for those that can afford or those that even understand that those shelters exist. Many ordinary women who make up the majority of our South African society do not even know where to go in the event they encounter violence. And when they go to the police station, police simply trivialize that and they don't treat it as a crime. It never gets registered in the statistics. And therefore, the statistics that we have are not reflective of the reality on the ground. And many women are put off because of that. But I also want to say to you, we need to seriously consider this as a compulsory thing for every workplace to have the childcare facility. It's a real put off for companies when they have to employ a very competent woman that happens to be pregnant. You come to an interview and they see that you are pregnant, it just puts them off. You just get automatically disqualified. Of course, they will never say you've been disqualified because you are pregnant. They will not say that, but they will not hire you. We have a lot of cases of women that are like that.
Are we using the correct blueprint, Lisa, in advancing the agenda of ending violence against women, for women to enjoy the right to live a life free of gender-based violence?
No, I don't think so, because our idea of prevention seems to be to run a campaign during the 16 days where we all say speak out. That's useless, because quite frankly, nobody listens. So, you know, we tell women to speak and they speak. They're on Twitter, they're on Facebook. They speak and they speak and they speak. But as I said, I don't see anybody who's really paying that much attention, and we're not seeing the kind of change. And when we say speak out, you're putting the burden on to women to take the action, whereas really it should be up to us to be thinking about how do we not condone or support violence. The other thing that we have to take into account is that actually changing men's behavior is a lot harder than we think. There's been some very interesting research that looked at a very well-designed program that was run over a couple of weeks. And that research actually suggested that in the area where that program was ran, it was not a success. And in fact, it made the most violent men worse. So, you know, it's a lot more difficult than for us to simply wag our fingers at men and say, stop it now, stop your toxic masculinity, you must now behave. That is much too simplistic. We need to be thinking much more around what it is that has a serious long-term effect. So I think what Dr. Khoza was saying, you need combinations of education. You need to have a valuing of women's work, whether they're doing the same work as men or not. You need to be putting in place services for women. So let me give you an example now. We pay all this lip service to the need for shelters, but in the Eastern Cape, they took 56 million rand away from services, children's services, older person services, women's services, in order to pay occupation-specific dispensation that is increases to those employed by the Department of Social Development. So we see this lip service, but we see when we scratch beneath the surface and look what's going on, it's not translating into the necessary action.
Yeah.
So I think that's our problem in South Africa. We're fabulous at saying all the right things at the right time. Things.
Bronwyn, it will take commitment to gender parity at all levels, more than just, of course, 16 days of campaigning.
Yeah, look, I mean, I can't agree with Lisa and Dr. Moore. They hit the nail on the head, really. You know, from our perspective, with our line of work, we do deal with a lot of the victims after the cause. So I think it has to come from two different levels. There has to be the long-term fight of how we're going to eradicate gender-based violence. It's been around for centuries, you know, but it is something that definitely needs to be tackled with a long-term plan. But there also has to be victim support that plays into it. Like trauma rooms at police stations are not functional. For 16 days of activism, we went and visited police stations all over South Africa. Some of them don't have beds, and the little things like this, like Doctor was saying, a woman goes to a police station, they don't know where else to go. But when they get to the police station, they're not equipped to help them. So it's these tiny things where we have to be focusing on the long-term, how to eradicate it, and when it does happen, what support are we giving these victims to make their lives better?
Yeah. Let's hear what our viewers are saying tonight on WhatsApp, sending through messages on 072-110-5584 to this conversation. From Jay in Mpumalanga, women are still being abused. If you take a look at how even the protection orders are being conducted, it's still victimizing women. Government should do more to empower young girls, even older women. Bronwyn, weigh in on this conversation on protection orders and how they are currently being conducted and how should that be improved?
You should be able to get a protection order from a police station, but most police stations don't give it to you. So you then need to go to a magistrate and, kind of put your case forward and get one like that. There are a lot of changes that are coming in with the new bill on protection orders. I prefer to comment on it once we see how it's rolled out and handled. But yeah, at the moment it is quite difficult to get a protection order. And it's also when people break the protection order, often nothing's really being done about it. We've had 2 victims that they're accused have broken the protection order, and to get him arrested, it just never happened. So, yeah.
All right, let's take another one on WhatsApp tonight. Balungile Mazibuko in Tembisa saying, as a woman, I feel we are still disregarded as inferior, or rather regarded as inferior when it comes to power. Domestic violence against women and children is still at a rise. I have been a victim of domestic violence for 2 years. I'm still attending court with no urgency on the matter. The cases of gender-based violence are just treated as other cases. I want to zoom in on that question of being regarded as inferior when it comes to power, Dr. Makhosi Khoza. When we speak of unleashing the power of women leadership, I know you mentioned earlier on that let's not just look at how many women are actually participating in the boardrooms or whatever and so on and so forth, but let's maybe talk about what the policies are saying meaningfully in impacting the lives of women. But let's talk about women participation in Parliament for a sec, and whether or not there is a change in this idea of women leadership.
Well, unfortunately, we have undone a lot in terms of the gains that we have made. We had absolutely wonderful women, and I beg to differ slightly with Lisa. I think representation of women in positions of power is absolutely critical. Unfortunately, right now, we've had some women that are in the position of power, not necessarily because they are competent to do the kind of job that they are supposed to be doing, but they are put in there as part of the system of patronage and, doing other people favors and so forth. A good example, when we had Phumzile Mlambo-Ngcuka as the Deputy President of South Africa, she was extremely passionate about women's issues. Even Baleka Mbete, to a very large extent, they were even pushing that within their own political party, the ANC. And I am saying to you, if you look at the representation of women now, it's no longer the same representation that we had previously. If you have women, you will either have women that are not necessarily ethical enough and that do not necessarily or maybe that do not take the gender-related issues seriously simply because they are now occupying a position of privilege. And I think it's going to be very important for us as women to ensure that we get the right women in these positions of influence, because they are the ones that are going to decide how we are spending. In fact, even the social development budget is not really enough. I mean, you are working in these NPOs, and I know how underfunded they are. And if we are not going to have relevant women in those positions of influence, we are not going to win the war that we are trying to fight. And as we speak right now, the quality of women, and I'm not generalizing, there are exceptions, but generally speaking, the women that we have in the positions of power are women that are negating the very agenda that we are trying to advance in as far as women are concerned. They are desensitized to the plight of ordinary women. And I think we need to get women that are not desensitized. Right. In fact, I think there is an opportunity for us with the new electoral system, right, that in the event that it is implemented, that we get a lot more women that are coming specifically as interest groups, so that when they are in parliament, they carry that specific mandate.
Dennis, appreciate your time. Unfortunately, we can't have this conversation for the whole 3 hours, but we've got other conversations waiting to happen as well tonight. Let me thank you all for coming through. Dr. Makhosi, Khoza, Vetten, and Bronwyn Litkie.